Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Today I'm joined by Right Ruminations and Master Sanders to specifically talk about the course of the Star Wars saga and more generally how that reflects the broader course of cinema from 1999 to the present. So, Right Ruminations, why don't you go ahead and lay the field for us here?
Well, there is a thing with the comparison between the original Star Wars trilogy and the Star Wars prequels, where at the hands of various Gen Xers and even millennials and others, the original trilogy is kind of upheld as this holy grail of filmmaking, and the Star Wars prequels get a bad rap as basically being trash and completely unworthy of the Star Wars name. And thinking that the Star Wars prequels are highly underrated. That is a view that I have had myself for a long time. And what we want to do is revise the comparison between the Star Wars prequels and the original Star Wars trilogy. And I think that one thing I would like to say in praise of the Star Wars prequels is its aesthetic advantage. Now, this is something that at the hands of Red Letter Media, it has been regularly criticized for. It has been said that it is that it looks fake, that there's too much CGI. But the problem is that those critics who say this are precisely the ones who have ushered in and approve of the post-2016 era of film and show making, which looks totally fake, looks totally unbelievable. Basically, everything everything that has come out since the Hobbit movies, or the vast majority of it, has, in an effort to look more realistic than the things that were coming out in the early 2000s, just come to look more and more insubstantial, thinner, more generic. Whereas by contrast, you can complain all you want about the computer technology that's used for the Star Wars prequels. Films of that era, like The Lord of the Rings or the Harry Potter movies, are quite substantial in terms of having a unique look, a unique feel, a kind of, you might say, almost classical aesthetic. And I think that really provided avenues for a legitimate escapism, and I'll go as far as to say that there's something aesthetically transcendent about them. There is a formalism about them, and it seems to me as if the people who are dead set against the Star Wars prequels really have no appreciation for the kind of aesthetic that George Lucas offered in the original trilogy and in his other films like American Graffiti. That is, they basically, in my opinion, mistook George Lucas for Steven Spielberg. They thought that he was just, another 1980s, 70s film producer who made things like Back to the Future and that followed a very specific formula. And then when they got something that was actually a pure expression of George Lucas, their response to it was just to say that this is garbage, that it's not what we had understood Star Wars to be. And I think that's because they didn't really understand the spirit of the franchise all that well in the first place. For laying the ground of this discussion, the groundwork, the last thing that I'll say is that I think that the Star Wars prequels really, in the company of other things that came out in the early 21st century, the early 2000s, like Lost or the Batman movies or the Lord of the Rings, really are symbolic of a golden age in filmmaking, which I think was much better than the 70s and is certainly much better than anything that is being produced now.
Yeah, well, one thing that's interesting to look at is the theory, of course, the nine canonical Star Wars movies, the numbered films. The first, 4, 5, and 6 were generally kind of pulpy and light and generally superficial as far as like depths or purpose. Like, why are they fighting? Well, scary space Nazis versus, apparently, according to Lucas later on, the Viet Cong, with the Ewoks at Endor. And then we see a bit more thoughtful. I mean, I don't want to overplay. I don't want to overplay it. It wasn't Shakespeare, but the rise of Palpatine as this sort of like master manipulator has like a Richard III elements to it. Uh, and then you've got the woke Disney abomination. And I think what really is telling about the haters of the prequel trilogy is that they love the Disney abomination. They bend over backwards to defend Disney. And whatever was wrong with the prequels is 100 times more wrong with Disney. And obviously Disney wasn't, these people weren't on Disney's pay for the past 20 years. But it does show, I think, just a juvenile aspect to these people and a non-seriousness about it. For example, if you don't like the Gungans, why did you like the Ewoks? I mean, teddy bears, come on. Also, the fact that they ruined so many people's lives. I mean, the guy who played Jar Jar Binks, Ahmed Best, almost committed suicide. And Jake Lloyd, by his own admissions, life was living hell. I mean, it's a movie. Like, come on, guys, grow up. And the fact that, and what I think is really sad about all this is who's responsible. It's the mob, it's the crowd, it's this mob outrage. So, Jake Lloyd, can't really show his face without getting attacked for being Anakin Skywalker. I mean, I don't know. How do you come back from that? I don't know. And, obviously you might say Jake Lloyd's performance wasn't the best, but compared to Rey and Finn, my gosh, I mean, those were horrible performances. And yet, they're praised across the board. And I think the real takeaway is these just aren't serious critics of the original prequels, and they're just throwing a tantrum. Master Sanders.
Yeah, I would agree. And kind of going back to Right Rumination's point, a lot of the criticism of Star Wars, particularly by the late Gen X and early millennials that dominated YouTube in the late 2000s, were predominantly from people who really didn't understand what Star Wars was. They thought, as you've rightfully pointed out, Right Ruminations, is that they considered Star Wars to be like another summer blockbuster franchise. Like much like you'd say Back to the Future, or let's say in the 90s, Jurassic Park, or what have you. They really underplayed this idea that, or at least they down. I guess a good way is either deliberately or unconsciously misunderstood what Lucas was trying to do with his films, and as a result, when Lucas attempted to do the same things that he did with the prequel, with the original trilogies and the prequels, they didn't understand it. Now the thing is, just about every criticism you have of the prequels could easily apply to the originals. For example, there's the special effects are overwhelming and it looks fake. Well, so do the originals, even in retrospect. And when Lucas tried to update them, you still had the same people that screeched as if he had somehow raped their childhood, as one person put it. They say the dialogue is clunky in the prequels. Well, the dialogue is clunky in the original films, right? And so they'll say, well, Lucas ruined. The only reason why the original trilogy was good was because Lucas was not as involved. That's actually a lot more of a complicated question than not. This sort of insane notion that the only reason why Episode 4 was any good was because it was because it was well edited. Well, so is every good film, right? That doesn't take away from the original vision that Lucas had, and Lucas did have some role in the editing of the film. And likewise, there's a little known story that Lucas was responsible for editing the final cut of The Empire Strikes Back, which in its final form was a complete mess, according to people who were in the know. So a lot of the criticisms of the prequels in many ways are unfair. And I think we're in a position we can name names. Okay, we can say, like, where does this really come from? Well, when the films came out, they were initially received quite very well. There were people who didn't like it, of course. and there are people who had issues with it. But for the most part, they did well in the box office and in the initial reviews, and including Roger Ebert actually thought very highly, or at least wrote very highly of Star Wars Episode One, even if people had issues with Jar Jar or maybe even Jake Lloyd's performance. However, it wasn't until the mid to late 2000s that you really begin to see more of a concerted pushback against Star Wars, or the Star Wars prequels, beginning with Red Letter Media. Now, the thing is, back then, Red Letter Media was the biggest voice then, because you didn't have people producing of that level of quality of films, of YouTube videos. And so, if you had a really good editing program and some skills, you could stand out really well. And the problem is that Red Letter Media approached it from what I think was a very juvenile and not very well informed approach to the prequels, and that sort of created the snowball effect where every other YouTuber who reviews the prequels just repeats the same talking points, to the point, even those that said they liked it when they were younger. We can get on a little bit of this later, but yeah, a part of this is that we are trying to reassess the prequels and how good they really were, or at least how artistically done they were, trying to recover what their real meaning outside of what we have been conditioned or in our culture, thanks to people such as Red Letter Media.
One thing I'd like to add to this as well is when you look at the complaints of the prequel, again, a huge complaint you hear a lot about is, well, there's the politics, there's all these boring discussions about politics and trade and everything. And I get it. I mean, what I think is interesting though is that 4, 5, and 6 were very, very superficial and juvenile. There's really no motivations for why people do what they do. I mean, for example, Leia's entire race is blown up, and even though she's a princess, she has no real authority anymore. So why is she so important in the rebellion? And also, she's not really sad that she lost everything. It's just not a human reaction the way Leia acts. Whereas Padme and Amidala acts much more like a flesh and blood human being when her people are under threat. So, but it's almost like when you sort of add a level of adult maturity where people have motivations, where there is intrigue, where there is politics. And remember, one of the most popular TV shows today, political intrigue shows like Game of Thrones. I mean, it's kind of laughable that say, oh, it's too much politics. That's boring. Well, I guess people like Game of Thrones. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why they like it. But it's all about politics. The whole premise of the show is politics. So, and then there were plenty of thrillers, in the Cold War about politics, Soviet-U.S. nuclear diplomacy. I mean, was Star Wars 1, 2, and 3 done as good as those? Maybe not. But the point is, that's not really, it really just sounds like children not wanting to have to think too hard. Right, Ruminations, what are some of your thoughts on this so far?
Well, to get back to something that Master Sanders said, I think that one of the things that's indicative of the Red Letter Media not understanding what Star Wars, and indeed George Lucas, not understanding what Star Wars was about, let's start with that, is that when they claim that the reason that the original trilogy was, in their mind, better compared to the prequels is because George Lucas didn't have as much control. Some people would then give a counter to that by saying, well, what about American Graffiti, Lucas's first major film? That's a well-liked film, and he had more or less complete control on that. What about American Graffiti? And the Red Letter Media guy actually said, well, I don't like American Graffiti. I don't think it's good. I think it's blown out of proportion. Now, let's think about that. American Graffiti is about 1950s cars and greasers. That has to be the most depressing topic that a human being could conceive of, George Lucas manages to take that and turn it in to like magical escapism of the kind that's actually legitimately comforting and can kind of absorb you into this kind of symphonic reverie or something. It's just like this presentation that's the lighting and the music and the atmosphere and the character dynamics that just this fits very nicely. And in fact, there is a lot, I think, in common with American Graffiti and the prequels, precisely because Lucas had so much control. I also think the fact that these people, as much as they may criticize the Disney Star Wars, the fact is they are not reacting to it as nearly as strongly in terms of their outrage as they did to the prequels. And to me, that shows that they basically think that whatever Star Wars was supposed to be, Disney came a lot closer to it than the prequels did, which to me just further cements the fact that they did not understand the magic of Star Wars. If you don't like American Graffiti, but you're willing to kind of give a mixed review to The Force Awakens or The Last Jedi, then it shows that it's probably a good thing that the prequels didn't live up to your idea of what Star Wars was supposed to be, because even if you like the original trilogy, as I do, I'm of the opinion that they were good as well. But if you were watching the original trilogy because of its similarities to what Disney Star Wars now looks like, but had no interest in the elements of the original trilogy that were more proximate to the presentation of American Graffiti, then you were watching the original trilogy for its worst elements and completely like failing to process its best elements, which is the fact that everything George Lucas puts his finger on looks, feels, tastes different from anything that almost anyone else is able to produce.
Yeah, Master Sanders, your thought.
Well, okay, kind of going back with Red Letter Media and you're mentioning of that, I think in that same episode, because in one of their Half in the Bag segments, they had the producer of The People versus George Lucas. And Mike Stacklasa was very reluctant to give Lucas any quarter on, not just on the Star Wars films, but also on THX and American Graffiti. So which I think at this point kind of demonstrates to you that, at least when it comes to the Star Wars films, RLM really doesn't have a good position that's rooted in anything that's artistic or reasonable outside of maybe a childhood nostalgia. Now, going back to this idea with why are the same people that are eager to defend the Disney films are also ones that will defend the original trilogy. Well, no, sorry, that will take the original trilogy as being inherently superior in every way to the prequels, or they'll bash the prequels. That's also quite an interesting question. When it comes to The Force Awakens, and this is sort of a pet theory of mine, but I believe that it is very true. When Star Wars was bought out and Lucasfilm was bought out by Disney, Iger, of course, was left with a considerably steep bill. I think somewhere between $4 billion, $4.5 billion, somewhere in that range, and they had to make good on their investment. And so when they were looking to make a film, I think to make a return on that investment, they approached people like J.J. Abrams or whoever they were going to produce this, and they told him, hey, look, make the most Star Wars film you can make. And I firmly believe that people like J.J. Abrams is probably very internet savvy. And J.J. Abrams knows of phenomena such as the Fandom Menace and others. And whether or not he likes them or not, he's well aware of their existence and what they say. And I think what he likely did is that he probably either watched Red Letter Media or he watched people who imitate Red Letter Media, and he basically made a Star Wars film in a way that Red Letter Media would want. So everything that Red Letter Media and the others criticized about the prequels, they took out of the sequels. So especially with The Force Awakens. So for example, going back to politics, one of the big complaints by people like Letter Media is that there was too many politics or too much politics in the film. And so in a situation where it's basically a repeat of the original trilogy, in a situation like you're wondering, how did we get here with the Resistance and the First Order? Well, they just skip it. They just don't talk about it. So the politics is just swept under the rug. There's more action. There's less, or at least we're told, less CGI. There's a heavy emphasis on nostalgia. And so basically, they made a Star Wars film that they thought Red Letter Media would like. And if you watch, I believe, the Half in the Bag that they made for The Force Awakens, Mike Stacosta said he liked it. And Red Letter Media was initially very defensive about The Force Awakens, and they kept saying that, Rey is a very charismatic character. They put down even Rogue One at the expense of The Force Awakens. And when The Last Jedi came out, they were very, very reluctant to criticize it in the same way that other people were being more vocally critical of it, until finally they were forced, I believe, to make a Plinkett review of The Last Jedi. And so even now, and with this final film, they just dumped on it completely. They dropped any pretense of making any defense for the sequel trilogy, although they addressed it immediately that, hey, no, this doesn't make the prequels better. It's just because the sequels are bad. And interestingly enough, although Mike Stacosta actually acknowledges it, it was in one of the Plinkett reviews, I believe, of Star Trek 2009. He said that Abrams would make a better director for Star Wars than Lucas had. And so this goes back to, again, I think Disney tried to cater to the RLM crowd. And while it succeeded initially, backroom politics, both on the corporate and on the ideological level, sunk any chances, I think, of Star Wars being any good, the sequel trilogy being any good. But in a weird way, RLM did shape a lot of our understanding of Star Wars. Although I do see, in particular with younger people, like younger millennials and Zoomers, you're beginning to see a little bit of a change on that, and you're seeing people saying, the prequels weren't so bad after all. And some are even saying that the prequels are actually good.
Well, there's another thing, too, that is just kind of bizarre. Like, the hate that George Lucas himself got, and then actors that worked for him, as I mentioned. I mean, obviously, Star Wars was his franchise. I mean, it's one thing if somebody takes something that you have that you like and then ruins it. But, because like Disney bought the rights and then ruined it. But if it's what the guy wanted to do all along and he finally got the chance to do it, I mean, that really is his prerogative to do it. I mean, anybody else would do what they want with their property. I guarantee you any one of these guys would say, it's my property. I can do what I want with it. Well, exactly. I mean, if that's what you believe, then this is Lucas's property. And there have been plenty of other movies that have just fallen flat, either as prequels or sequels, actors that didn't do as well as people thought they should. But this sort of pathological hatred that lasts for a decade or more, I don't really know where that's coming from. That's just really inexplicable. I haven't really seen that in any other movie at all. Like Right Ruminations. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think that getting back to Abrams and his treatment of Star Wars in The Force Awakens, I'm going to say something that I think a lot of people will disagree with, but like a lot of people, when I first saw The Force Awakens, I did like it at first, but that was one of the reasons is because it had been a long time since I'd seen Star Wars, so I was just kind of treating it like another movie. However, I quickly came to not like it very much, and I certainly didn't like anything else that came out of it. And this, I think, provides a nice transition into something we were talking about before we came on, which is, why did I have that initial reaction to The Force Awakens that was then disappointed? It's because I do believe that J.J. Abrams is a good director in his own way, or at least was. I don't know if he's directed anything good lately, but he did shows like Lost and Fringe and Person of Interest and Alias that all had this kind of substantialness to them. That is, that they all had a mood, as it were. They weren't just kind of generically gray the way everything is now. And I think that they were really kind of byproduct of that era of the Star Wars prequels. They were very much of that mood. You might almost call it a kind of sturdiness or something. And I think that when I saw it, I thought, okay, maybe this is what Star Wars will be like now. It will be a little more adult. It will maybe not quite have the same magic that George Lucas did, but maybe there will be elements of, maybe it will be a little darker, maybe a little bit more PG-13 or something, and maybe in a certain way a bit artsier. And so I was kind of expecting like a J.J. Abrams TV show to be the next iteration of Star Wars. And I thought, oh, well, okay, well, I guess we'll just have to live with that. But it's not the end of the world. Like the kind of thing that you'd almost expect to have like Stephen King homages in the middle of it, the way his shows do. But however, any chance of that being the tone was quickly dashed with Rogue One, with The Last Jedi, and in which I think we realized that it wasn't just going to be a J.J. Abrams TV show, and in fact, it was instead going to be like a superhero franchise. It was going to be that my presupposition as to what it might look like was because I was projecting 2016 or 2015 into the future indefinitely, not foreseeing how starkly things would change. And in fact, far from it being something that would be taken more seriously, it came to be something which was infinitely more difficult to take seriously and much more childish than anything that was in the original trilogy. And the reason I think that Abrams was able to put up a kind of facade in certain parts of The Force Awakens, not other parts, like the parts with Chewbacca or Han Solo or like some of the goofy jokes, it gets bad pretty quickly. But there are some things at the beginning, like with Kylo Ren, the stormtroopers on the transport, and Jakku, where it does have this certain freshness about it. And I think that the way I look at it is that it was the last breath that the Force Awakens was both the last fresh breath of fresh air and the first breath of poison air that in moviedom in general. That the Force Awakens kind of has a foot in both camps. It was the end of the era of the prequels, of things like the Titanic or the Batman movies or Lost or what have you, and was the first breath of this new poison we've been breathing ever since. And so I almost see The Force Awakens as a kind of meta trick, almost like a pretend version of what Star Wars might have looked like going forward, and looked nothing like that. And I really do think that demarcates the end of the old era and the beginning of the new era, in which nothing Star Wars or otherwise seems to be much worth watching.
Master Sanders, what are some of your thoughts?
I mean, I would say that I liked the Force Awakens when it came out, and I would say most people did. You know, there's a few that can claim, and we have documented evidence that they didn't in terms on the YouTube sphere, but for the most part, I think people liked it. Now, a lot of us noted at the time, including even when I liked it, that the film did seem like a retread of A New Hope. And I think at the time I was kind of willing to give it a pass because, like, okay, this is sort of a soft reboot. They're trying to kind of give this a fresh start, and there was a bit of freshness in it. You know, I would agree with Right Ruminations there. A little too much Marvel humor for my taste, but for the most part, I thought it was okay. There were parts that, obviously some ideological agenda was driving through. But I think this actually brings us to a bigger problem with the sequels, and that the prequels do not suffer. The sequels, I think, from what we've learned, a lot of behind the scenes politics and some other issues at Lucasfilm, is that there really was no overall arching plan, or if there actually, well, let me take that back. There was, but it was thrown away by Rian Johnson. And the reason why the sequel trilogy feels so disjointed is because it is disjointed. There really is no plan. There was the original plan, and that was shifted by Johnson. And then because Johnson put it in a corner where you really couldn't write yourself out of, they had to do all kinds of basically undoing or retconning or soft retconning of everything that Johnson did. As if anybody who saw The Rise of Skywalker, you can see that he did. That was obviously done. And so it was just a complete mess, just an absolute mess. And so, which at least with the prequels, you could see that, okay, whether or not you liked it or not, you could tell that George Lucas put thought into not just the overall arc, but how the arc would fit in within the broader Star Wars universe. As he said, as one of his quotes from the behind the scenes documentary was, "While the scenes don't repeat, they rhyme." And people have actually been able to point out that there is some level of symmetry to the films, to the first 6 films at least, that are not necessarily apparent on first watching, but you do get to see. Interestingly enough, Red Letter Media dismissed this idea for obvious reasons, but I think it's fairly clear that Lucas put a lot more thought into the prequels than was put into the sequels. Yeah.
Yeah, and this actually kind of gets, I guess, back to the point that Right Ruminations was getting at. Beginning in 1999, there was really these 3 trilogies, or not, well, 2 of them were trilogies. One was an ongoing series, movie franchises that dominated the early 2000s. The Star Wars prequels, the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and the Harry Potter saga. And it was just huge. Like, I remember back then, it was crazy. Like, there was just wall to wall, all this stuff, and there really hasn't been anything like that before. And really, afterwards, not a whole lot like it afterwards. I mean, these were fresh, they were new, they were exciting. Though I have heard the Harry Potter special effects have not aged very well. So yeah, Right Ruminations. What are some of your thoughts on that?
Well, as an aside, I'll say that as much as I do like to include the Harry Potter movies in this, I think you might appreciate it if I make note of the fact that the characters in Harry Potter, in particular the wizard teachers, remind me a lot of "'Twas Ever Thus" High Church Christians. But no, I think that is true. And if you look back, what's interesting is that even the cartoons for children were a lot better than a lot of the adult films that are coming out now. They all had this common density to them. Like, I can even point out to a few, maybe specific properties. Like in color theory, there's something called, and I may get this wrong, I'm not a visual artist, but my understanding is that there's something called saturated color, where it's like the pure version of the color, and it actually looks blander because of that. But if you add some gray into it, if you add other colors, if you saturate it, it actually gives it a denser, more vibrant, more alive look. So if you look at something like the Joker, the coloring is very stark, right? Like, you see a red vehicle in the background, and it looks almost too red. It looks like it stands out or something, but it doesn't really have any vibrancy to it. Whereas all of the, like, even like I say, the cartoons, like the Emperor's New Groove, like the Atlantis cartoon, like Monsters Incorporated, they all had this this kind of high presence of desaturated colors. The that just made them come alive. And I think that there are also some other properties. I think that there was a strict like dichotomy of ideology, that it was clear who the bad guys were, it's clear who the good guys were. If you had an anti-hero, like in Breaking Bad, I would say Breaking Bad was at kind of at the tail end of this whole phenomenon, even though it was more realistic. But you still have, like, Walter White is a clear anti-hero, right? He's not a hero or a villain, but he's also not this kind of like try hard, gritty realism in between. No, he's a cut and dry anti-hero. And so there's like an ideological compartmentalization, a certain color scheme, and a kind of composure, a seriousness, a certain like, and you see it. This is synchronistic with the like the culture of the time. So, like, for example, I support Donald Trump. I think he's a better kind of president than has been had in a long time politically. But there are, in many ways, things that are easier to take seriously when he's actually in office with Barack Obama. The same way as there'd be some things that are more serious about Nixon, right? So the original trilogy was produced kind of in light of Nixon, and then the prequel era, that's the era of George W. Bush, and then Barack Obama belongs to that same kind of block of time in which other movies that maybe share these properties were released. That there was some degree of poise left, like even with somebody who's rather bumbling, like George W. Bush as the president. He still was not like Ocasio-Cortez or as kind of loose in his mannerisms as somebody like Donald Trump. That is, there was this kind of not to make it sound crass, but a kind of boxiness that was still there, that had just a sense of aliveness, or a sense of like reality about it. And I think you had that in the cartoons. You had it in these major franchises that you mentioned. And I really think that it's indicative of the aesthetic of the era, that there was something bold about that era. Like, okay, let me point out that big tower, the highest standing building on Earth, the Burj Khalifa in Dubai, looks like it's straight out of the Star Wars prequels. And that, by the way, is aesthetically my favorite building. And that is so kind of part and parcel of the boldness of the aughts, as it's called. Like, people like Millennial Woes will look back at them and say, oh, it was just a dismal hangover from the 90s. Actually, I believe that the aughts, even beyond the fiction, were a kind of unique expression of human cultural boldness in some ways that almost had certain classical elements to it. And I think that there's a synchronicity between this and the kind of fiction that was able to be produced in light of that culture, and may have also influenced it. And then in today, the tandem tandem between the fact that you have politicians that kind of are like the Green New Deal people, or Mitch McConnell or whatever, and this just taking place in synchronicity with this fictional garbage that's being put out. I think that there's a clear narrative picture that one might almost say is Jungian or archetypal about how things have progressed.
Well, I think one thing that's interesting is, I think what these, say, the first decade of the 21st century with the cinema, what made it so grand, and I think there was a bit of millennial hopefulness, like, this is the new millennium, we get to start over, we can have this exuberant optimism, grand sweeping. There's a marked lack of cynicism in this material, right? Everything today is cynical, everything is ironic, everything is just meant to subvert expectations. There's no actual message of any kind. It's just using these methods to just deconstruct everything. Whereas, with Star Wars and the Lord of the Rings, they're there wasn't this attempt to deconstruct. There was an attempt to create something that we would all want to watch or want to remember. And, Lucas and Jackson succeeded. I watch The Lord of the Rings every year. Star Wars, not so much, but I watched it a couple of years ago, all three of the prequels. And, they age better than I remembered. Like I said, I think a lot of people have been unfair to the prequels. But I think this millennial hopefulness was part of it. So, Master Sanders, what are some of your thoughts?
Well, I mean, I think Right Ruminations can speak to more of this than I can, but I think he's right in the sense of there, at least when it comes to the prequels, that there was much more of a classical element to it, not just in the aesthetics, but I think we can agree also in the story, which, of course, is the broader tragedy of Anakin Skywalker going from someone who had great potential, who was destined to do great things, and yet was, of course, because of his tragic flaw, that is his inability to let go and his inability to be rational, or at least to be ruled by his reason more so than his passion. That's what resulted ultimately in of course, his turn to the dark side. As in going to how will the prequels be remembered, I think we're already seeing a renewed interest in the prequels for a multitude of reasons. One is that younger millennials and Zoomers that grew up with the prequels are now adults, or they're reaching adulthood, and they're expressing, fondness for them. So in the same way that many of the early millennials and Gen Xers grew up, and they were exalting the original trilogy over the prequels, albeit in this case there seems to be another area of renewed interest in the prequels has actually been in the meme scene, right? So prequel memes have still been very hot over the past couple of years, taking advantage of some of the clunky dialogue, and actually finding quite a bit of humor in it. And in that sense, they've come to really appreciate how good Star Wars is. And so, for example, a lot of the old ROM people would probably criticize Anakin's acting, or at least Hayden Christensen's acting, as being cringy. And while the meme scene would make fun of, yes, they would play on that, and they would make fun of Hayden Christensen's portrayal of Anakin, there has also come in the humor the realization that, hey, actually, given how Anakin's character was set up, Hayden Christensen's performance here actually does make sense. And so and in the humor, there has been a realization that the prequels are actually pretty good, or at least they're better than we remember. So I think in the future that the prequels will be remembered with not only with fondness, but they will be remembered as something of quality. The sequels, I do not think will as well. Going back to what the time that they speak to, yes, the prequels sort of speak to the Bush era, and the and the original speak to the Nixonian era. The problem is that with the haphazard nature of the sequels and the much more blatant ideological elements of the sequels, I think it will not age as well, particularly since our culture seems to be souring a bit, at least on the popular level, against this sort of woke feminism. And you even had people that were noting some of the more quote unquote problematic implications of Rey ending up with Kylo. And so even it falls flat in its attempt to be woke. So I don't think the sequels, given the fact that they were in many ways a cash grab, and that they were too much of their time instead of speaking to their time, I don't think that they will age as well.
Well, I think one of the things about the prequels and how they'll be remembered is, again, most of the animosity towards the prequels came from a certain generation, the generation that grew up with the Orig Trig. And that generation is becoming older, less relevant, and will eventually die. And not to put too fine a point on it, but once they die, a lot of that built-in animosity will go away, because it's really more just butthurt rather than a sort of aesthetic, artistic judgment. And I think for the same reason, the sequel trilogies will fail, because they're too, like you said, too tied up in a certain zeitgeist of an era, which isn't going to be easily translatable to other eras. Ruminations, what are some of your thoughts?
Well, I do disagree simply because I think that the prequels fit in so well with the original trilogy. Like, let me put it this way. If you take Han Solo or you take Princess Leia or whoever you have, they clearly, I think I can imagine them in the same universe as Qui-Gon Jinn. However, I cannot imagine Qui-Gon Jinn occupying the same universe as Kylo Ren. And so I suppose that the atmosphere of continuity is something which may involve the prequels dragging the original trilogy along with them. And just to add it to the fact that one of the things I liked about the prequels is that I thought that they continued nicely from the original trilogy. Now, with respect to something that Master Sanders said about just going beyond the aesthetic, because it is true that I hold aesthetics to be of importance and kind of like maybe the philosophical mood behind the aesthetics. But I think that if you want to go beyond the aesthetics, there is something that lies between pure storytelling and the nuts and bolts, the technical aspect, and the aesthetic aspect, and that is the psychology of the prequels. And I think that the prequels, like many other things, had a psychology that really fits with the early 2000s, or at least the best, most laudable aspects of the early 2000s. If you mention, say, the woke feminism that is striven for in the sequel trilogy, you find a very different type of feminism in the Star Wars prequels. And let me paint a contrast. In the Star Wars prequels, when you watch them, you are guaranteed to end up not thinking about sex or gender at all. Now, whether one thinks that's a good thing or a bad thing is another question, but I do think that there is something projected in terms of a worldview in which everyone is this kind of stoic individual. That women are women, yes, and men are men, but there is like a kind of a transcendent element which seems to operate almost independently of that. What I would say is that, and I had a conversation with a friend about this, in which I said, if you say have ultra traditional gender roles, you know, like a traditional Catholic couple, and they're really like into the gender roles, what are you going to think about when they're around? You're going to think about gender. What are you going to be thinking about if you see some feminist walking down the street and half of her head is shaved bald? You're going to think about gender. What are you going to think about if you have got some kind of, macho man prancing around trying to prove his masculinity? Gender. What would you think about if you woke up and both like men and women were exactly the same? You'd be thinking about gender. But in the prequels, it's like the gender dynamic is so subtle and so not proximate necessarily, but that there's just the right amount of difference between the genders and just enough closeness that you watch it and you aren't even thinking about those as concepts, because it's like everything just sort of fits so nicely into place. And I think that this is almost like a projection of what people in that era assumed feminism would look like, that it would just kind of be something that could gracefully be pulled off, that it would not actually compromise femininity and masculinity, but would almost kind of be like the almost like Warren Farrell adaptation, as it were. I think subconsciously it spoke to that expectation, whereas the feminism that you see in the Star Wars sequels almost reminds you of something very depressing, like Stefan Molyneux talking about like third wave feminism and gynocentrism or something. And it's just, immediately what you're thinking of is gender. And one thing I will note about Rey and her character in relation to the male characters is that, and this is kind of, this really is reflective of third wave feminism, that she, in some ways, Rey actually acts more starkly feminine than the traditional Star Wars female characters, because she's almost acting like less like a kind of early 2000s strong woman, and she's coming more across like some kind of spoiled feminist brat or something. And so in that sense, I think that once again, the contrast between the two types of gender modern conceptualism in comparison with one another is very indicative of the two eras in which these franchises have been released.
Okay, Mr. Sanders.
Yeah, I think you make a really interesting point. I think the reason one could argue that Rey is a little more feminine in a traditional sense, at least when she's struggling with the idea of who her parents were and her the loneliness that she feels. So I will give you that, but I think the scene that comes to mind is, especially in the first of the sequel movies, the scene where they're on Jakku and they're being chased by the stormtroopers, and Finn keeps trying to reach out and save, or try to lead Rey by the hand, and Rey keeps refusing his hand. That's probably one of the more indicative feminist moments. In a weird way, sequel movies do have quite a bit of woke feminism. There's also a bit of the other extreme too, this sort of for lack of a better word, this sort of Twilight-esque schlock of this idea, kind of changing the bad boy, making him good, that you see in a lot of that decidedly unfeminist or faux feminist fashion. And so it's this weird mixture of the two that managed to satisfy nobody. And that was apparently, very blatant at the end of The Rise of Skywalker, where you had a lot of fans that raked J.J. Abrams over the coals for having Rey end up with her abuser, in the same way that women tend to do in these sort of Walmart shelf erotica. So it's, I guess the best way you can put it is that the sequels are just one giant hot mess.
Yeah. So we'll open up for closing statements. I'll give it to you first, right, Roman?
Yeah, just take a moment just to briefly build on that before wrapping up, and saying that, I mean, I would agree with the particulars of what you're saying, Master Sanders, but how I would counter it is by saying that what you're describing is not really a mixture. What you're describing is basically the reality of third wave feminism, that in many ways, third wave feminism is more feminine. And I might draw people's ire by saying this, but I think that that's one of the things that in some ways is more off-putting about third wave feminism. That, like, when Rey it sort of angrily dismisses Finn for trying to take her hand, well, that is the kind of sense of touchiness or entitlement that I suppose might be bred by the sort of traditional understanding, at least on an emotional level, that has been afforded to women in society. Whereas, I suppose if a character tried to take Amidala's hand, it would kind of be like, why would that be worth getting worked up about? Like, who cares? Like, there's almost too much of a maturity of psychology to get worked up by that, because I think that in Padme's character there is a kind of male psychology that's more able to just shrug things off. So what I would say is that a lot of the feminist entitlement that is afforded to Rey is indicative of the fact that Rey actually is a more feminine character in the most unlikable way possible. In terms of closing statements, I would just say that this has been, I'm very glad to have finally been able to have had this conversation, even though it was a kind of impromptu idea. I think that it's a good step in addressing the need to restore golden age in Western pop culture, namely the early 2000s, not just with respect to Star Wars, and not even just in respect to film and television, but indeed, I think that there were good elements of the 2000s that are really not matched by anything that has been going on of late. And I look forward to the time when perhaps what has gone around will once again come around. Thanks for having this conversation.
You're welcome. Mr. Sanders.
Yeah, there's not a whole lot to say I think that other than what's already been said, but I do think the prequels day is coming, if it hasn't already, where people will really recognize the genius and the artistic work that went behind it, even if there was an immediate backlash in the years following its release. If maybe Lucas sold it to Disney, so people would learn to appreciate it. Who knows? But I think again, the prequels day is coming if it hasn't already come, and hopefully we will be able to mature, at least when it comes to our assessment of pop culture, to go beyond just simple nostalgia and just enjoy something for what it is without turning it into an idol or without getting out of proportion for it.
All right. All I have to say is I agree with Lumpowaru that Jar Jar Binks is a Sith Lord, and with George Lucas that everything is about Jar Jar Binks. This is Todd Lewis from the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.